When you're ready, Anne.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joanna. Okay, great. Well, hello everyone, and welcome. Just got a wee bit of WebEx housekeeping before we get started. So just to remind you, and you're probably still all coming in now, so we'll take a few moments, but just to remind you that the session is being recorded. But you don't need to worry because your mics are automatically off, and so is your camera. So we can't see you, but we will be able to see comments in the chat. So you're really welcome to use that during the talk, and that's something that we'll go back to at the end. So yeah. Well, just by means of a wee intro, I'm Anne Bevan. I'm an artist and a curriculum leader for art and design here in Orkney. This seminar series is part of the UHI Hark and Silk Clusters research theme exploring ideas around the edge. So I'm really delighted to be here to introduce you today to our speaker, Dr. Antonia Thomas. Antonia is an archaeologist and a lecturer based at the Archaeology Institute in Orkney, at Orkney College, and Antonia is the programme leader for the Contemporary Art and Archaeology Master's Programme. Antonia's research focuses on the relationship between art and archaeology in its broadest sense, from the interpretation of prehistoric visual culture to the intersections between contemporary art practice and the archaeological imagination. So, as well as being a close colleague of Antonia's, we work together on the Contemporary Art and Archaeology programme. I can also say that we've shared many an interesting conversation, so both in the field, on the shore and in the studio. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to your talk, Antonia, and so without further ado, I shall hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anne. Right, I'm just going to try and share my screen. Here we go, see if this works. Okay, is that all visible and can you see that? Is that all fine? Can you see that, Anne?
Yeah, that's all looking good. Yeah, I can see that. Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, super. Oh, well, thank you very much. Yep, so I'm Antonia Thomas, and I'm going to talk to you today about art and archaeology. There's loads and loads and loads of different ways we could talk about this. It's such a broad area. It's two very broad areas that come together to make an even huger one. And so there's only time today to really talk about some aspects of the relationship between art and archaeology. So in a way, I've sort of cherry-picked things which I find interesting and that we also look at during the course of the MA that we're running here in Orkney. The focus is kind of going to be quite broad, and it's not going to be just to do with the Highlands and Islands or Orkney at all, but it's going to kind of paint a bit more of a kind of global context and history for how we can think about art and archaeology. I'm interested, however, in how contemporary artists and contemporary archaeologists are working together in this area, and I'll get onto that later on in the talk. But first of all, I really want to set a bit of kind of context and background for how we might think about the relationship between these two, sometimes what seem like very opposite kind of disciplines. I'm going to come back to the place that's shown in this picture, the Global Seed Vault in Svalbard in Norway, later on. But first I want to start with a very different sort of collection. This engraving, which shows one of the first examples of what we might now think of as a museum, was created by Ole Worm, a 17th century Danish physician, linguist and natural philosopher. This museum, the Museum Wormianum, I can never say that right, is one of the earliest known cabinets of curiosities or pictures of cabinets of curiosities. And it's shown here in an engraving which was published after his death in 1655. And it's absolutely wonderful. You can just look at all the different things in the picture here. You can see that there's everything from specimens of the natural world to scientific instruments, ethnographic objects, all sorts of manner of things which we would now probably classify in a modern museum under different categories: archaeology, natural history, ethnography, etc. And these sort of cabinets of curiosities, these sort of early museums, were really sort of meant to enthrall and entertain. This was an age of kind of great excitement about all these things, and show off the wealth, taste, and knowledge of the particular curator or collector. But I've started with this image because it really goes to the heart of how we might think of art and archaeology. Because even now, when we're thinking about contemporary art and contemporary archaeology, these kind of ideas, collection, curation, display, the fetishization of objects, these are still themes which absolutely run through art and archaeology and the relationship between them. Artifacts and objects which are absolutely fascinating, but also deeply problematic. And it's these sort of issues that a lot of contemporary artists explore when they work with archaeological, archival, or museological kind of themes in their work. It's not just the pure aesthetic fascination of these places, but also goes to a deeper kind of critical kind of picking apart of what it means to collect and display. I just love this image. It's from an installation by Rosamund Purcell, an American photographer who often kind of focuses her lens on objects that have been collected, objects of scientific interest, natural history. And it's a reconstruction of Olive Orme's museum. It's actually moved around different cities and collected different kind of objects to represent the places where it's been installed. But it's now permanently set up in Copenhagen, which has of course got a unique connection to the original museum by being Olive Orme's original city. And this is how it is now. And I just absolutely love this piece and the way that photography and this installation, this piece of installation art, highlights the unbroken link between these early collectors and how we see the world now, the relationship between art and archaeology. And surely any critical visual discipline, whether it's in the arts or humanities, has to engage with this deep history. So in focusing a lens on these sort of early collecting practices, this sort of work is really exciting. But to go back again, those sort of early collections, those sort of cabinets of curiosities, have sort of evolved over several centuries. What were once the personal collections of wealthy individuals, many of whom made their money in kind of their involvement in trade that involved enslaved peoples and very kind of painful colonial practices, became national institutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. And as part of all of that, and this is of course the British Museum shown here and kind of fragments of the Parthenon frieze, the antiquarian movement itself became absolutely inextricably linked with nation building and nationalism. And so we have this situation today where we have these deeply problematic institutions like the British Museum shown here, which are purely, well, not just purely, but really function as treasure houses, all presented for our viewing pleasure. And I'm not going to dwell too much on these sort of aspects because that's a kind of whole different, huge and complex conversation to be had. But what is really important to note is that the history of art and the history of archaeology is absolutely bound up with these sorts of histories. It's bound up with colonialism, and as such, it always has political implications in the contemporary world. And the investigation and analysis of this sort of romantic and nationalist cultural and historical context is essential to understanding not only the development of archaeology as a discipline, but also the relationship between contemporary art and archaeology now. Of course, this sort of sense of romantic nation building was not just apparent in museums in the 19th century, but also kind of widespread across art and literature. And here we have William Daniels, an etching from his voyage around Great Britain in the early 19th century, around 1814 to 25, when he made these journeys. And shown here is the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, then known as the Stones of Stennis, although now we would associate that with a different site. And this was one of the most ambitious of a whole series of topographical publications made around this time. And they provide us with some of the earliest and some of the best representations of archaeological sites. And this, of course, is another way we might think about art and archaeology, this long history of romantic and other representation of particular sites and monuments. Many of the sites Daniel visited became places of pilgrimage for romantic artists and writers. People who were turning their back on the kind of neat order of neoclassicism and turning to a more romantic age, to an imagined past of ancient landscapes and monuments and the power of the forces of nature. There's perhaps, in the context of kind of 19th century romantic thinking about ruins and about things like this, no better site for this exploration than Pompeii. The drama of the volcanic eruption, the idea of a natural disaster engulfing a city and apparently freezing it in time, the romance of the ruins themselves. And this is the Temple of Isis at Pompeii here. And Pompeii mania was absolutely rife in the 19th century. And many academics and artists were absolutely obsessed with it. The late 19th century, of course, was the golden age for this sort of antiquarian activity and early archaeology. Archaeology loomed large in the popular and the academic imagination. And it also, of course, lent itself very well to new technologies of seeing and representation, particularly photography, which emerged around the same time. Excavations such as those at Troy provide us with some of the earliest photos of archaeological sites and excavations, and they remind us of this shared history between archaeology and photography, as they both arose around the same time in the 19th century, and both appeared to freeze time and capture the past. And that brings us to one of the ways we can explore the relationship between art and archaeology and their interconnectedness. One of the most powerful aspects of archaeology, that of archaeology as metaphor, particularly excavation as metaphor. And we can't talk about that sort of thing, of course, without mentioning Sigmund Freud. And Freud was a massive archaeology obsessive. He even once said that he'd read more about archaeology than he did bother to do about psychology. He accumulated large numbers of artifacts from his cousin, Moritz Freud, who was a trader in antiquities, and he kept these in his consulting rooms. You can see some of them on his desk there. He often used these as props to start conversations with his patients. And like many others at the time, he was absolutely fascinated with Pompeii, often using the sort of burial that appeared to happen and the excavation works that uncovered the bodies apparently just frozen at that point in time as a metaphor for the repression of the unconscious and its revelation through psychoanalysis. He was obsessed with the idea that for many of his patients, they feared being buried alive the most, and how this worked as a metaphor for psychological stifling. For Freud, the mind was also stratified like an archaeological site, made up of long forgotten layers which needed to be excavated. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy were a particular favourite, not only for the incredible archaeology and the process of unearthing these layers, but the fact that the excavations as well were a realisation of Schliemann's childhood dream. At the age of 8, the young Heinrich had declared he would one day excavate the city. So you can see how this was just hugely, hugely appealing to Freud on loads of different levels. The house itself, of course, in London is now the Freud Museum. And you can visit and you can see the couch and the rug and the antiquities and all these amazing things. It also has very strong links with many artists. It's been involved with a huge number of artistic commissions and residencies during its time as a museum. And many of these have created very famous bodies of work, particularly Susan Hiller's incredibly powerful work in the 90s after the Freud Museum, which was exhibited in the Tate. And Sophie Kahler, Mark Wallinger, and many more. And you can actually look at their website and see these huge number of really interesting kind of artist works. But one particularly fascinating example for today's talk is this one from 2015 by Adam Broomberg and Oliver Chinarin. Entitled Every Piece of Dust on Freud's Couch, their project forensically analysed traces on the famous couch, on the rug, on the Persian Qashqai rug which covered it. Now, the rug itself, like any sort of rug of this age, is sort of covered in a thick layer of household dust, most of which is skin cells, hair, cloth fibres. And the artist became fascinated with this, wondering if there were fragments of human DNA that might even relate to some of Freud's famous early patients, such as the kind of Dora and the Wolfman, who he wrote about extensively. Now, I just absolutely love this sort of microarchaeology of dust. And dust itself is absolutely fascinating when you start to think of it in that way. And I could have spoken for about an hour just about the art and archaeology of dust, drawing upon the work of people like Caitlin De Silva, who's theorised how we think about dust and debitage, and also a great number of artists, including Moira Davey, Ai Weiwei, and others who really look at dust as matter. But in this piece, Broomberg and Chinarin turned their forensic images into large woven tapestries that mirror the scale and texture of the original covering, and then draped one of these over the couch, replacing the rug with an abstracted portrait of a kind of speculative humans that the remains might be analysed forensically. And this sort of abstract microarchaeology is a really wonderfully imaginative and sort of subjective form of forensics. So what we have here is a sort of playing around with the methods of doing archaeology. But of course, the clearest examples of this sort of thing, of artists doing archaeology, are those artists who actually do a form of excavation themselves. Here we have an example of archaeology being used as performance, a stage set for an artist to play around with the idea of a place within a place. This is Simon Fujiwara's Frozen, a site-specific installation from London's Frieze Art Fair in 2010. And in this, he used a tour guide to shuttle small groups of people around 6 of these excavation sites he'd created, the unearthings of which were referred to as the Frozen City, a hotbed of debauchery and corruption, which is supposedly once occupied the same site as the Frieze Art Fair in Regent's Park. So it's a very playful sort of piece, critical of both the art world and the archaeological establishment at the same time. But what fascinates me about this piece is the attention to detail. And look here, for example, at the blue plastic crate in the bottom left of the picture. This is a mushroom crate, the sort of thing you get in supermarkets. And that's what he's using in his pretend trench. So for me, this really highlights the performance of archaeology, materials and methods. This isn't an artwork, but a genuine excavation, the Nessa Brogger in Orkney. And this is another example of the theatre of archaeology. Just look at what's going on in this picture. There's about 100 tourists, there's a BBC crew, there's the excavation team, and what they're all looking at, the focus of their attention, is Nick Card, the site director. And he's actually excavating a very delicate whalebone mace head at this point, under the watchful eye of all these people. And the stage is set. And just look at Anne Mitchell, who's the finds assistant there, holding the acid-free paper just behind Nick, and just look at what's at her feet, that blue mushroom crate. We actually use these exactly the same as Simon Fujiwara had in his installation. And this sort of playfulness that a lot of artists work with, you can't really talk about this without talking about Mark Dion, who for years, really for decades now, has really been playing around with the tropes of excavation, the methods of archaeology, cataloguing, the typologies, but also the site huts and places like that. And this is some examples of his work here. And the fact that these are such common tropes within contemporary art has made a kind of curator, Dieter Rollstrater, actually kind of sees it as a thing, a real kind of movement, a real trend within contemporary art. In 2013, there was an excavation called The Way of the Shovel at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, building on an earlier set of papers he did of essays Rollstrater wrote for the Eflux Journal, where he talked about how what he called a historiographical turn in contemporary art, what he saw as artists turning to themes to do with archaeology and excavation in their work. But although he saw this as a particular thing from particularly in the 90s and noughties, actually burial and excavation have provided artists with kind of rich material and have been a driving form in contemporary art for a lot longer. And we're just going to look at a few examples now. This quite a famous example, this is David Spoeri, an artist best known for his snare pictures, where he made sort of assemblages capturing a group of objects such as the remains of meals eaten by individuals, etc., and then displayed them on a wall. So quite archaeological kind of ideas to start with, frozen assemblages, as if they were uncovered by being covered by ash at Pompeii. But this is a kind of different piece. In 1983, Spoeri invited 120 members, personalities from the contemporary art world at the time, to take part in a banquet shown here on the left, organised by him to mark the renunciation of this series of works, to mark the end of his series of snare pictures. But in the middle of the meal, the whole thing was buried in a 60-metre long trench dug into the lawn. Tables, tablecloths, crockery, cutlery, graffiti, dedicatory notes, photos, etc., all of it buried under the earth during a collective ceremony organised by the artist. And then, in 2010, it was excavated by a team of French state archaeologists as a part contemporary archaeology, part contemporary art performance event, archaeology uncovering something that was deliberately buried by an artist. So, burial and uncovering, art and archaeology. A rather darker example here, Bruce Naumann's audio-video underground chamber from 1972 when it's first shown. A single concrete vault, dimensions close to that of the human body, buried like a coffin, 1.5 meters under the ground. And the only thing you know as a viewer in the gallery about this space is the live broadcast and the blueprint drawings you see in the gallery. So there's a lamp, a camera and a microphone in the space as well, transmitting back. So image and sound call up these associations with the psychic and existential areas around what his work often revolves, feelings of isolation and claustrophobia, feelings of being buried alive, all very Freudian. And there are many other examples of burial in contemporary and older art too. You might think of Claes Oldenburg or Keith Arnott and Derek Bruner, amongst others. But what I really think is interesting about this art that plays around with ideas of burial is that they all play around with idea about time and possibility, imagined and speculative pasts and futures. Because although they can exist without one another, excavation tends to go hand in hand with burying or incavation. And the flip side of that is that burial always at least suggests the possibility of excavation in the future. So you can see that here too. And back to Mark Dion again. And in 2000, in preparation for the Museum of Modern Art's in New York's extensive rebuilding project, they invited Mark Dion to perform a series of archaeological digs in outside of the museum. And he recovered various things, pillars, fragments of foundations, historical artifacts such as cornices, mouldings, ceramic glass and things like that, and various things from the kind of demolished buildings that once occupied the site. But he also found more recent material, including the remains of Bruce Naumann's audio-visual underground chamber, which had been installed in the garden as part of the artist's 1995 retrospective. So here we have the curious example of an artist playing at being an archaeologist who actually excavated another artist's work that itself was quite resonant of archaeology. So we have, it all gets this kind of quite crazy meta kind of situation. And Dion's kind of cabinets and displays also, however, put me in mind of something else. And that's Robert Smithson's non-sites shown here. Of course, Smithson, as many of you know, was one of the artists playing around with ideas of landscape and site, material and process in the 1960s. Conversations that took art out of the gallery and into the landscape, and also took the landscape back into the gallery, really playing around with ideas of site and place. His idea of non-sites is particularly resonant with archaeology, and the idea, particularly the idea of preservation by record that we talk about in archaeology, and we do. The dislocation of the site, which then only exists as an assemblage of maps and objects, artifacts. So it really raises ideas to do with context and place that we deal with archaeology all the time. And it's interesting for archaeologists to think about these ideas because there's a very particular history between archaeology and landscape, mapping and cartography. And not surprisingly, again, it goes right back to the history of the discipline and the particular way of looking and trying to control and colonize places. And so we have these incredible maps. This is a map from the 1850s. This is the Stennisbrogger area in Orkney, a very, very accurate map with military accuracy. But of course, there are other ways, better ways to think about landscape. And again, we kind of a lot of archaeologists, draw inspiration from a lot of 60s movements, particularly the land art and the process-led environmental art of Richard Long and others. And his famous line made by walking, which really talks about process and different ways of kind of mapping and occupying landscape and place and environment, have been really, really influential. A very different way of thinking about land. From a line made by walking to a map made by walking. These examples here are by Dan Lee, an archaeologist who works with contemporary art and materials and processes to really subvert the way we think about mapping. These maps here, this is the left-hand one is a map made by walking around the island of Papi. It's a map of the festival. We were archaeologists in residence at a contemporary art festival in Papi a few years ago. On the right-hand side is a map made by walking around the island in one go with a GPS receiver and referencing various points of the festival. And these sort of, there's a long history of these sort of things, both in art and in contemporary archaeology. And it can be understood in the context of a growing sort of movement in critical cartographies and also experimental approaches to mapping and mappings, which have some antecedents in situationist movements from the 60s onwards and things, and are really developing new understandings of site and place. And what they do is make you realise that there's a whole load of things we take for granted about the way we see land, sites, monuments and maps. This is thought to be the earliest or one of the earliest aerial photographs of an archaeological site, Stonehenge of course, taken in 1906 from a hot air balloon. And the history of aerial archaeology or aerial photography in archaeology is a whole other area that we haven't really got time to talk about today. But what is significant is how it influenced so many modernist artists and how it actually fundamentally changed the way we see landscape and places. This wonderful kind of couple of pages is from John Piper's Prehistory from the Air. The artist, this is from 1937. As an artist, he was hugely influenced by aerial photography and also archaeology. And I just have this image in here because I just think it's just such an incredible juxtaposition of images to have in any publication. On the top left there, you've got an antiquarian etching of Silbury Hill, a Neolithic monument in Wessex. On the bottom left, you've got a fantastic kind of RAF aerial photo of the site. And then on the right, you've got this wonderful painting by Juan Miro. So a kind of incredible kind of combination of form and shape and thinking about kind of ways of looking at sites and landscapes. For John Piper, archaeology hugely influenced his work. This is a kind of mixed media piece he did, kind of collage piece, Archaeological Wiltshire, showing kind of lots of famous sites there. For him, aerial photography and flying was more than just a way of looking. It absolutely changed the way we thought about space. He said, "The significant thing is that from the air, horizons vanish. The change is one of elevation to plan. The picture has tipped over backwards onto the floor, and in being raised again, it's brought part of the floor with it." So a complete turnaround of how people saw themselves in relation to landscape and the world. Excuse me. And of course, a generation later, many other artists as well in different ways have also been inspired by prehistory, monuments, and different ways of thinking about landscape and how we fit into and experience it. Wonderful example of land art, absolutely beautiful piece here by Nancy Holt, these concrete sun tunnels, which are celestially aligned with, and they're just absolutely wonderful. And certainly if I ever get to see them, I would be delighted in the Utah desert. Okay. And many contemporary artists now continue to be inspired by the kind of more enigmatic prehistoric sites and forms of archaeology that we have, particularly in the UK. This image is from a recent installation from last year by the artist Josephine Pride in Berlin. And it comprises a series of huge images of Neolithic and Bronze Age rock art, many of which are from the open air in Northumberland, where Pride's from. And they're blown up and abstracted to a scale which really makes you think differently about their form and about their texture, both inside and outside the gallery. And I love the kind of contrast here with this flat roofed, very blocky kind of building and these very textured photographs of the rock art. This sort of playing around with scale and juxtaposition to explore depth and surface really fascinates me as well when I take photographs of different archaeological surfaces and rock art myself. So I now want to kind of move away from thinking about archaeology in this kind of quite traditional sense of old things and actually move the conversation on to thinking about more recent material. In particular, I want to think about archaeology as a kind of contemporary archaeological approach, and particularly archaeology as surface survey. Archaeology is a process of assembling and reassembling, a different way of thinking about surface. In this image here, this is taken from, this was taken during the Flow Country project, an interdisciplinary project between Dutch filmmaker Jasper Koppers and Dan Lee. And this is a contemporary archaeological survey mediated through the production of a 16mm film in the Flow Country in the kind of peatlands of Caithness in northern Scotland. This flux tower here measures the release of carbon from the bog. And so it's a whole project all about kind of energy of different forms through time, about landscape and how we mediate these relationships and experiences through archaeology and film. And of course, contemporary archaeology has a very particular relationship to contemporary art. It's naturally interdisciplinary. It draws attention to the performative nature of doing archaeology and collapses time in a way which is absolutely fascinating. Contemporary archaeology, as well as looking at more recent material and material from now and into the future, also recognises that all pasts exist and are understood in the present. The archaeology of all periods is engaged with and interpreted through the lens of now. This is the Nap of Hower here, those stone buildings with their little bit of grass on. thought to be the oldest buildings or oldest houses in Northwest Europe. They're about 5,500 years old. And this is a view you don't often see so much. This is the concrete seawall, which is really quite a kind of incredibly, quite fascinatingly ugly kind of look to it, contrasted with the stone buildings. But it really highlights how kind of all these different times and types of sites kind of merge together in archaeology. One artist whose work I really admire is that of Antonia Berklands. We worked with her when we were archaeologists in residence at the Papegøyen Nights Festival. And Tonya is a Norwegian photographer whose work involves playing the role of different characters. And here she is playing the role of Lumiere, a 19th century photographer. And then she photographs herself in different scenes. And here she is in Brooklyn during a residency she did in Williamsburg. And what I particularly like about Tonia's photos is she's not trying to recreate some sort of mythical past. She's not bothered about the authenticity of the cityscape in the background. It's actually all about how the past punctuates the present and how the future and the present also punctuate the past. It's all about time. Another photographer whose work I've been enjoying lately is that of Rachel Sussmans, an American photographer who's also absolutely fascinated about deep time, the deep past, and also the future as well. In this project, The Oldest Living Things in the World, she set out to photograph the oldest plants that there are, and this incredible green thing here, which looks like it's maybe from another planet or from Teletubby land, is actually a densely flowering shrub. It looks like a moss-covered rock, but it's about 3,000 years old. It's absolutely incredible. Now, what fascinates me as well about her work is that she's not just interested in things which are really old, but also interested in the way that we play around with ideas of what's future and what's past. In another set of work she did, called This Used to Be the Future, she looked at the remains and the ruins of space centres, space research centres, and all the detritus was left behind. This project called This Used to Be the Future. And this is decommissioned equipment from various space missions. Another artist who delves both into the deep past and the deep future and journeys between space and Earth is Katie Patterson, another artist who I absolutely love. And this is her Timepieces solar system series from 2014. And this is a series of 9 clocks that tell the time on planets in the solar system and the moon. The durations of the day and night range from planet to planet. And I absolutely love this piece. Like a lot of Patterson's work, it's so simple, yet speaks of such big things: space, time, and the cosmos. And that brings me on to thinking about space archaeology. And you might think it's quite unusual to think about space archaeology, but it's actually a growing field. It's a really kind of serious and important bit of archaeological research happening. Just look at this visualization. This is a NASA visualization showing the 8,000 plus human-made objects which swirl around in the Earth's orbit. Satellites, rocket stages, bolts, flecks of paint, etc. All made by humans, all derived from Earth, all archaeology in one way or another. One place in our solar system has more sites than most: the moon. There are currently over 60 places that you might consider archaeological sites on the moon, places where human culture has interacted or landed. Material from the US, Japanese, USSR, Indian, Israeli, Chinese and European missions. Footprints, vehicle tracks, artwork, golf balls, flags, even a family photo shown here, which was left in 1972 by Charles Duke. Exposure to radiation from the sun has probably bleached it completely white by now, but it's still there. There's even something like 96 bags of human waste dumped on the moon. So when we think about archaeology, we have to also think about this material as well. A lot of discussions now are also focusing not only on colonising outer space, but also about mining the moon. And this raises all manner of ethical kind of discussions to be had about who owns the moon and whose right is it to collect this material. Space missions continue, of course, and it kind of reminds me about how those early cabinets of curiosities we saw earlier were actually all collected in the name of science, but now fill our national museums. And I kind of like to imagine a future where we have museums which are filled with moon rocks and moon mission debris as well. So there's a lot of Earth material on the moon, and of course there's a lot of moon material here on Earth, collected and studied, but very much here and archaeology. And I couldn't talk about moon rocks without showing one of Anne Bevan's lovely pieces. This one, Moon Rock, and I'm sure Anne will speak to you more about this later if you want. And I was in Estonia and made in response to a decommissioned lighthouse on the island. And the silver form could be seen from the mainland, providing a kind of navigation point for the boats sailing past. A lovely piece there. But you might think all this talk about the moon and about space isn't very archaeological at all, or that space archaeology is a bit too abstract for archaeologists to get involved in. But just look at this, Elon Musk's roadstar Tesla, with its dummy payload circling around as an artificial satellite. It's a piece of material culture from Earth. It's absolutely archaeology. And it's also hard to think of a better symbol of greed and late capitalism. Archaeology, with its origins in the collection, study, fetishization of non-Western and non-modern cultures, landscapes, people and artifacts, and archaeology's connection to colonialism and expansion makes it better placed than most disciplines to comment and analyse what we're doing in space right now. It makes me think about archaeology in the future, and I have to put up this wonderful diagram made by taken from Cornelius Holtorf's and Daniel Lindskog's Archaeology Today, which really kind of, if you look at it, unravels the connectedness of what we think about possible futures, plausible futures, assumptions and narrative of the past, and how it's all kind of intertangled. And that leads me on to some recent projects which explore these sort of ideas. Like Rachel Sussman's photographic project, say This Used to Be the Future, looking at the kind of the past futurist space missions. The project about to start with Dan Lee and Richard Irvin, looking at the archaeology energy in Orkney, explores similar themes. And we might also think of sites such as Dounreay, nuclear power sites, which have been the focus of kind of a lot of both contemporary archaeology and artistic explorations. And here it is shown under construction. And of course, many artists have also been interested in this. This is a still from Gare Dunlop's film, Atom Town, where he explores Dounreay, really thinking about kind of, since its decommissioning in 1994, the sort of cleanup problem it presents, but also the ideas of modernism to do with the town of Dounreay itself, and all the kind of possible future narratives that were bound up in this wonderful modern ideal. But it raises all sorts of questions about our relationship with future generations, between what we save and what the future might want. And that brings me on to the seed vault again, which again has been the focus, particularly of the work by the Heritage Futures team and other contemporary archaeologists, who have really been looking at what we save for the future and the conflict with the present. This is a global seed vault. It contains all sorts of seeds, so in the event of a global catastrophe, we can sort of repopulate the plant ecosystems of the planet. It's meant to be buried deep and very safe, but in 2017, it was actually breached by some melting permafrost. And of course, again, that takes us back to Katie Patterson's work, and particularly her future library. Inaugurated in 2014, this 100-year project will has one writer every year contributing a text alongside this forest, and the forest planted in Norway supplies paper for this anthology of books. So this is like a 100-year project which absolutely projects into the future and raises all sorts of things to do with ecology and knowledge and the interconnectedness of these on our planet. And I have to, when I'm talking about art and ecology, just link here to the work of Helen Garbett, who is doing a creative practice MRes at the UHI. And her work in the Human Limpet project is really exploring these connections between not just art and archaeology, but also ecology and socially engaged practice. And we'll link to a talk she's giving tomorrow evening after this. And all of this brings us into thinking about archaeology now, archaeology in and of the Anthropocene, this kind of word that's been given to the geological epoch we're apparently now living in, a kind of age of plastic. And it makes us really think about how we do archaeology, because archaeology has had to change. Over the last 200 years, the world is very, very different. We're dealing with different materials, sites, landscapes and people, different ways of collecting than we ever have done before. And so archaeology has evolved along with the world. As I say here, new questions require new approaches. And we can think about archaeology as assemblage, of course, and I have to link here to Amy Balkin's work, there's actually a deadline of tomorrow for anyone who wants to contribute to this. Her archive, A People's Archive of Sinking and Melting, where you can contribute objects. It's a community gathered kind of project from coastlines which are going to disappear. And this is a kind of artist who's really working with the idea of assemblage and climate change as a form of sort of a contemporary archaeology. I'm worried I'm going to run out of time here. And do I need to wrap it up a bit, you think?
You've got a few minutes, but we've got quite a few questions appearing, so yeah,
okay.
A couple of minutes.
Well, I'll try and whiz through these last few slides, but what I want to kind of just highlight is new ways in which we're going to be doing archaeology and thinking about archaeology in the future, and also how that might relate to we think about art. And one of those things is the archaeology of digital data. We tend to think of archaeology as very materially focused, to do with physical objects. But in the future, we're going to have to absolutely engage about how we collect, manage, deal with and display digital intangible data. One of the archaeologists who looks into this sort of thing is Colleen Morgan at the University of York. And she even excavated a hard drive as a contemporary archaeology project, a kind of good exploration of methods, but also very theoretically informed to kind of ask these sorts of questions. But key to all of this sort of thing is thinking about memory, because if we're talking about what we take forward into the future, whether it's nuclear waste or digital data, or thinking about the environment of future generations, it's all about what we want to take forward, but also what we want to take from the past. And this sort of brings us back to those sort of museums and those sort of really difficult conversations that museums and monuments that I showed at the start of this talk about. And this is Cara Walker's Fons Americanus from 2019 in the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall, a reworking of the Monument of Victoria outside Buckingham Palace as a monument to the transatlantic slave trade. And what is kind of key to all of these things about art and archaeology really is this kind of need to bear witness and to sort of rewrite stories to give kind of a voice to people who have generally been written out of mainstream history. And it's absolutely this need to bear witness which is driving some of the most exciting projects at the moment. We might think also of Rachel Kiddie's important work on forced migration and material culture as well. And nearly there. And also some of the most exciting work that's happening in the art world is actually involving huge numbers of collectives from different disciplines. This is an example of forensic architecture's work. This is on a camp outside of Belgrade, where they used archaeological techniques to highlight the conditions and inhabitation of people living on this camp before they were forcibly cleared. And forensic architecture is an interdisciplinary research agency at Goldsmiths involving artists, architects and archaeologists. In 2018, they just lost out the Turner Prize to Charlotte Prodger. And this is my last slide, so I'm sorry for running on a little bit. And this brings us back to Scotland and also brings us back from a very global sort of way of thinking about art and archaeology to a much more personal history. And for me, that's the kind of most exciting thing about how archaeology is able to mediate all these different areas, because it's always global and personal at the same time. It's always able to negotiate personal narratives as well as feed into much wider historical conversations. And I better wrap it up there, otherwise we won't have much time. So just going to say thank you and sorry for running on. I didn't think I was talk so much. So I'm going to stop it there.
Thank you so much, Antonia. I'll do my clap on behalf of everybody. I think we would all quite happily listen to you all afternoon, to be quite honest. So I don't think anybody was wanting to rush you there. What an amazing speed back, forward, beneath in time and place, and just wonderful. Thanks. And I learn something new every time you speak, and we've spoken a lot over the years, so thank you so much. Oh, some fantastic comments coming up in the chat there, just lots of appreciation, and a few questions. So I'll try to kind of go back on some of the earlier ones, if that's okay to start with, Antonia. There was one that came up, and excuse me, I might have to take glasses on and off here, but it's from Stephen Cogbill. It was when you were talking about dust. So Stephen's wondering if, I've wondered before if archaeological tourists carry the dust from Orkney to, for example, Stonehenge, and whether in the future it might be analysable and, in brackets, perhaps misleading. Any thoughts on that? I suppose it's a contemplation on how we're going to look at those intangible things. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's quite nice, isn't it? And I think that in the 19th century, people used to actually chip off bits of monuments, didn't they, and take them as souvenirs and things and spread them around, and they turn up in all sorts of strange places. And I guess we're all still doing it in some way, aren't we?
It's the idea of erratics, isn't it? Dust particle erratics. And one from Kate, lovely sort of comment and then a question. So great, Antonia. I'm thinking of Henry Glassey's thoughts on historians and their need of tradition. He believes in order to de-link them from ideas of time being separated into distinct and clear periods of events, turning them into the continuum, the constancy of change, not as singular events, but an ongoing. Here's the question. Do you have any thoughts on how archaeologists need artists, or perhaps more broadly, the activity of creativity? Is art interacting with archaeology, like Glassey's tradition with history? What's been enabled and generated? What are the barriers to the generative relationship? So that's a lot of questions, Kate. Maybe Antonia can select one of those. I think you might have addressed it in your talk.
Which is what can archaeologists learn from artists, which is loads, I think. And I think every time there's so many artists I admire, and I could have shown so many other things today, but just the ones I've shown, every time I look at their work, I learn something different about archaeology, about time, about our relationship to space and material culture and place and site, and also about myself. And I think kind of there's so much we can learn from artists, but it's not a kind of one-way street. I don't think. I think it's about these messy, wonderful conversations where everything's tangled up and we all bounce ideas off each other. And it's less about art and archaeology, but it's more this space where there's all these other things as well. And I think we're all it's a great time to be experiencing that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's one from Carol Johnson. Fascinating stuff, thank you so much. Outside of my knowledge, but wondering if the larger scale or stunt type works like Elon Musk's and Damien Hirst's Treasures of the Wreck of the Unbelievable are distracting from and or demeaning the more intimate, informed and potentially impactful works that have been discussed here?
No, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, kind of, but it's just a kind of example of how, you know, it's all kind of connected, these space things, and it's just such a colonial, horrendous thing to do, isn't it? You know, sending is such a ego trip to do it. I mean, it's just a, yeah. I shouldn't say it because we're recording. He's such a horrible man, isn't he, Elon Musk? And it's just
he might be in the talk. Watch out. Well, somebody that is in the talk. Great to have you here, Helen, and that's Helen Garbutt. That's nice that you're here, and a good link for your talk as well tomorrow in the blog. Yeah, where have we? Lynn Powell. Have you come across Robert Maxwell's work on the archaeology of Chernobyl? Very interesting, and she came across him tangentially whilst working on the archaeology of Belfast's peace walls.
Yeah.
Yes,
and he's one of the, he's one of the people, if you're interested in all this stuff and you're kind of new to contemporary archaeology, you're interested in all these things, I absolutely say get in, you know, try and, I can put some reading up if anyone wants to get in touch and stuff, but this is it's a hugely expensive book, but it's if you can access a kind of library and get it, it's got so many amazing things. And you can also engage with CHAT, which is the Contemporary and Historical Archaeology and Theory group, who are full of amazing academics who think about these things all the time.
Fantastic, yeah. I think we've just got, well, Susan Torrance is commenting. She says the future role of museums is fascinating. Glasgow Museum has far more material in storage than on display. Why? If not on display, is it a knowledge bank? Why just for Glasgow? Good question.
Yeah, very good question. Yeah.
Roxanne's enjoying the associations between disciplines and artists' approaches. Thank you. Roxanne's the programme lead for art and social practice. So we've got lots of overlaps in our programmes, which is really great. Lots of thanks. Lots of enjoyment. Marvellous, brilliant, fabulous. Lots and lots of lovely comments. Best picture of Nap of Howard ever. Mark, yes, that was amazing, wasn't it? Wow.
It's not my picture, that was by Dan Lee.
Dan's picture, yeah, it was brilliant. I was kind of going, where is that? It's a long time since I've been. Yeah, Rachel says it's art and archaeology is her favourite subjects. Great, fantastic. And of course there is the recording, which Joanna is saying will be available tomorrow. Rosie's loving the Freud sofa. Yeah, that was a lovely start there, and it looks like a flying carpet. Okay, and yeah, we've got the link to the Limpet art project, I think. Oh gosh, there's lots and lots of, yeah, that's great. Sorry, I'm just reading this out. Link from Dan for the chat group conference. And wow, I think, oh, here, Anna Kirk's asking, you've outlined examples of current archaeology. Are there any examples where you can predict or anticipate a future dig?
Well, I wonder if the future is not in digging at all, since it's, you know, we have enough artifacts and it's quite an unsustainable thing to do, isn't it, as well? So. Oh,
yeah, I know. Lisa says it's lovely to see your face, obviously a friend. And yeah, Rama says thank you very much. Very interesting, and appreciating you taking the time to share your knowledge with us all.
I appreciate everyone to listen, actually. So thank you, everybody. It wouldn't be much without you.
Oh, well, thanks again, Antonia. That was absolutely brilliant. And, you know, really appreciate all your kind of commitment and insight, really, to all of this subject. And it's challenging, you know, and I think that's the thing. It keeps us all on our toes of thinking and making. And I think that's the great thing about it. And it's wonderful to have, you know, joined you with your talk today. Thanks again. And thanks for everybody for joining. And thanks to Joanna for being behind the scenes there, doing a lot of work in the background. But thanks so much, Joanna, for setting this up and supporting the EDGE seminar programme. So I think on that note, we shall probably wish you a good rest of the day and have a great afternoon. And I'm sure we'll see you very soon in the future. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.